The sun had barely risen over Jacksonville, casting a warm golden hue over the city, when Officer John Richards buckled his son into the passenger seat of his unmarked patrol car. It was supposed to be a normal morning, the kind that Officer Richards relished a quiet drive with his teenage son to school before starting his day. In the fast-paced world of law enforcement, these moments were precious. His job required long hours, intense focus, and the constant risk that each day could be his last. But in the mornings, when it was just him and his boy, there was a sense of calm, a brief escape from the dangers of the streets. His son, Michael, had recently turned 14, a lanky kid with a mop of brown hair and an easygoing smile. Michael often shared his dreams of becoming a musician, strumming his guitar late into the night as his father listened from the other room. Their bond was strong, and these moments on the road were a time for them to connect. As Officer Richards merged onto the main road, something caught his eye. A white sedan was swerving between lanes up ahead, its erratic movements impossible to ignore. His instincts kicked in, and he shifted gears, his body tense with the sudden shift from father to officer. "Hang tight, bud," he said, glancing over at Michael. "Something's off with that driver." Michael, used to his father's job pulling him into unexpected situations, nodded, though a flicker of worry crossed his face. He knew how dangerous his father's work could be. Richards accelerated, drawing closer to the sedan. The driver, later identified as Kevin Rogas, was only 19 years old, a kid himself, yet already veering down a violent path. On the surface, Rogas had been like any other teenager. He had friends, hobbies, and a family that loved him. But underneath that facade, a storm had been brewing. He had recently fought with his girlfriend and had spiraled into anger, drinking heavily and getting lost in his own head. That morning, Kevin had no intention of stopping for anyone. His mind was a blur of rage and confusion, and the last thing he wanted was to deal with the law. But he was about to come face to face with it. Richards flicked on his lights and siren, signaling Rojas to pull over. The sedan slowed, coming to a jerky halt on the side of the road. Richards' training guided him through the motions, parked the car, radio in the stop, assessed the situation. But as he prepared to exit the vehicle, something went horribly wrong. Before Richards could even unbuckle his seatbelt, Rogas leaped from his car. In one swift, terrifying movement, he pulled a gun from his waistband and aimed it directly at the officer's windshield. The world seemed to slow down as Rogas squeezed the trigger. 4 deafening shots rang out, shattering the windshield and tearing through Richards' body. The bullet struck him in the face, stomach and hand, sending waves of agony coursing through him. Blood splattered across the dashboard, and Michael screamed, frozen in terror, as his father slumped forward. For a moment, everything went black. But Officer Richards was a fighter. Even with a bullet lodged in his skull, he wasn't going to let Kevin Rogas get away without a fight. With every ounce of strength he had left, he grabbed his service weapon and fired back. His vision blurred, his body weakening by the second. But he aimed for Rojas, determined to protect his son. Rojas, caught off guard by the retaliation, stumbled back. Without thinking, he fled. Panic coursed through his veins as he ran toward a nearby truck, hot-wiring it with shaking hands. The engine roared to life, and he sped off, leaving Richards and Michael behind in a cloud of dust and fear. Back at the scene, Michael reached for his father, tears streaming down his face. Dad, stay with me." Richards, barely conscious, managed to open his eyes, his vision filled with nothing but the blurry image of his son's terrified face. He wanted to reassure him, to tell him everything would be okay, but he couldn't find the words. Instead, he lay there, fighting for every breath, the weight of his injuries pressing down on him. Somehow, in the chaos that followed, a bystander called 911, and within minutes, the sound of sirens filled the air. Paramedics arrived on the scene, working frantically to stabilize Richards. They loaded him onto a stretcher, racing to get him to the hospital, while officers fanned out across the city, searching for Rojas. In the truck he'd stolen, Rojas' mind was racing. He knew what he had done. He knew there was no going back now. He had shot a cop multiple times. His life was over, and he was certain the police would be coming for him. He drove through the streets at breakneck speed, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. He couldn't think straight, his mind clouded by fear, anger, and regret. Eventually, Rojas crashed the truck into a neighbor's house, the front of the vehicle smashing into a wooden fence with a sickening crunch. Dazed and bleeding, he stumbled out and made his way into his own home, where he locked the doors and barricaded himself inside. His thoughts were a jumbled mess. He knew he was trapped, but his fear of the police and the overwhelming guilt of what he had done kept him rooted in place. It didn't take long for the police to track him down. They surrounded the house, calling for him to come out, but Rojas refused. Instead, he stood behind the glass door, gun in hand, his mind spinning out of control. He knew the officers outside wouldn't hesitate to shoot him if he made a move, and they did. As Rojas stood there, contemplating his next action, officers fired through the glass, hitting him multiple times. He felt the searing pain in his torso, leg, and hand as the bullets tore through his flesh. He crumpled to the ground, the gun falling from his grip. The next few hours passed in a blur. Rojas was taken into custody, his injuries treated before being thrown into a holding cell. Meanwhile, Officer Richards was in surgery, fighting for his life. Michael, shaken but unharmed, sat with his mother in the waiting room, his hands still trembling from the shock. The days that followed were filled with uncertainty. Richards had survived the attack, but his recovery would be long and painful. The bullet that had struck his face had caused significant damage, and he would carry the scars of that day for the rest of his life. But he was alive, and for that, his family was grateful. Kevin Rojas, however, had sealed his fate. The charges against him were numerous: attempted first-degree murder, attempted manslaughter, aggravated assault, grand theft auto, and fleeing the scene of a crime. There was no doubt that he would be going away for a very long time. Months passed, and eventually, the day of the trial arrived. Rojas, now 20 years old, sat in the courtroom, his face devoid of emotion as the jury delivered their verdict. Guilty on all counts. The sentence was life in prison, with additional 15-year sentences for the lesser charges. Rojas barely flinched as the judge read the sentence, though his family, sitting behind him, broke down in tears. His mother sobbed quietly, her face buried in her hands, while his father sat beside her, his face pale and drawn. But Rojas remained smug, even as the judge admonished him for his actions. For the cold-blooded attempt on Officer Richards' life, Rojas didn't seem to care. He had long since come to terms with his fate. This was his life now: prison, isolation, and regret. As the judge finished delivering the sentence, there was a quiet murmur in the courtroom. Then, the door at the back of the room opened, and Officer Richards walked in. The room fell silent as he made his way to the witness stand. His face bore the scars of the shooting, a permanent reminder of the day Kevin Rojas had tried to end his life. But Richards wasn't there for pity. He was there for closure. Rojas sat up a little straighter, his smug expression faltering slightly as Richards locked eyes with him. For the first time since the trial began, Rojas looked uncertain. "I will take those bullets instead of a fellow officer or innocent bystander," Richards began. "If there was a coward on that day, it was Kevin Rojas. When I brought the fight back, you ran like a coward," Richards said. Kevin Rojas, the smug young man who had shown no remorse throughout the trial, seemed to shrink a little under the weight of the officer's words. His bravado was cracking, the mask of arrogance faltering. Then came the moment that would become infamous. Richards wasn't finished. He had something else planned, a symbolic gesture that no one in that courtroom would forget. "I've got a little gift for you," Richards continued, his voice cold, but laced with a dark sense of justice. He reached into his bag, his movements slow, deliberate. The eyes of everyone in the room were locked onto him, unsure of what was coming next. Even Rojas leaned forward slightly, his hands fidgeting in his lap. Richards pulled out a small bottle of key jelly lubricant and slammed it down on the witness stand, right in front of Rojas. The bottle rattled loudly against the wood, breaking the silence like a gunshot. A few gasps echoed in the room, followed by murmurs of shock and disbelief. "You're going to need a lot of this where you're going," little man Richards said, his voice cold as steel, his eyes never leaving Rojas. The meaning behind the gesture was unmistakable, and it cut through the remaining facade Rojas had built around himself. For a brief moment, Rojas's cocky smirk returned, as if he were trying to shrug it off, trying to pretend he wasn't affected by the officer's taunt. But there was no hiding the slight tremble in his hand. No masking the way his jaw clenched in anger and humiliation. He couldn't meet Richard's gaze. The courtroom was buzzing now, the murmurs growing louder as people exchanged glances, some shaking their heads in disapproval, others with tight-lipped smiles of satisfaction. The judge, who had been watching the entire exchange, cleared his throat, a frown creasing his face. It wasn't his job to interfere with the victim's statement, but the message from Richards had clearly crossed a line, blurring the boundaries of professionalism. The officer, however, didn't care. For him, this was personal. Rojas had tried to take his life, had tried to murder him in front of his son. The weight of those moments, the fear, the horror was something Richards carried with him every day. His scars were physical, but the emotional scars ran deeper, and they were still raw. To face the man who had tried to tear his life apart, who had left him permanently disfigured, Richards needed to reclaim some of the power that had been stripped from him that day. Rojas was eventually led out of the courtroom, his smirk now gone, replaced by a simmering anger. He had been humiliated. Not just by the officer's words, but by the reality of what lay ahead of him: a life behind bars. A life where every day would be a reminder of his actions. A life where he would have no control, no freedom, no future. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. News of the trial had spread across Jacksonville. and people had come to witness the sentencing of the young man who had nearly killed a police officer. Reporters stood with microphones, cameras flashing as they documented the scene. Some people held signs supporting the police, others merely watched, their expressions a mixture of relief and satisfaction. For Richards, the trial and sentencing had brought some measure of closure, but it didn't erase the trauma. The scars on his face and body were permanent reminders of that day, and every time he looked in the mirror, he saw not just the man he was, but the man he had become, the survivor of a brutal attack. In the days that followed, the footage from the courtroom went viral. It was shared across social media platforms, stirring heated debates and discussions. The sight of Richards slamming the bottle of lubricant on the stand, his cold words echoing in the background, was both shocking and polarizing. Some applauded the officer's actions, seeing it as a form of justice, a way for him to take back power after being so viciously attacked. They saw it as a statement, a warning to anyone who might think about attacking law enforcement in the future. "Good for that cop," one commenter wrote on Facebook. "Rojas tried to kill him, and he deserves to be humiliated. He's going to spend the rest of his life in prison, and that's exactly where he belongs." Another user agreed, writing, "If you're going to try and kill a police officer, you'd better be ready to face the consequences. That cop is a hero, and Rojas is just a thug who got what was coming to him." But not everyone saw it that way. Critics were quick to call out Richards for what they viewed as unprofessional behavior. To them, the officer's actions, while understandable given the circumstances, crossed a line. "A real professional wouldn't stoop to that level," one critic wrote. "What kind of example is that to set? As law enforcement, you're supposed to rise above, not sink to the level of the criminals you're putting away." Another commenter chimed in, saying, "The officer has every right to be angry, but using a gimmick like that during a sentencing? That's just petty and undermines the justice system. Let the sentence speak for itself." The debate raged on for days, with people on both sides weighing in. News outlets picked up the story, adding fuel to the fire. Some even interviewed legal experts who questioned whether Richards' actions could affect the case in any way, though most agreed that it was unlikely to have any legal repercussions. In the midst of all this, Rojas sat in a prison cell, his life now a far cry from what it had once been. The reality of his situation had finally begun to sink in. The courtroom taunt, the life sentence, the knowledge that he would never walk free again, it weighed heavily on him. His family, devastated by the outcome, had left the courtroom in tears. They had tried to stand by him, tried to understand how their son had gone down this path. But now they were forced to face the harsh truth: Kevin Rojas was a convicted felon, sentenced to life in prison for a crime that could have ended far worse. Rojas' mother had always been his biggest supporter, her love for him unwavering even as he spiraled into darkness. She had sat in the courtroom, her heart breaking as she listened to the details of what her son had done. She had wept silently as the judge read the sentence, knowing that her son's life was effectively over. And as she left the courthouse, her legs shaking beneath her, she knew she would never truly be able to reconcile the boy she had raised with the man he had become. Life in prison wasn't easy for Rojas. The weight of his crimes followed him everywhere, and the other inmates knew who he was. Some feared him, others mocked him, but no one pitied him. He was just another criminal, another young man who had thrown his life away in a moment of violence. Time passed slowly in prison. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months, and Rojas found himself consumed by anger. He hated the guards, he hated the other inmates, and most of all, he hated Richards, the officer who had survived. In his mind, Richards was the reason he was here. If Richards had just stayed down, if he hadn't fought back, maybe things would have been different. But deep down, Rojas knew the truth. It wasn't Richards who had put him here. It was him. He had made the choices that led to this moment. He had pulled the trigger, he had taken the path of violence, and now he was paying the price. Richards, on the other hand, was trying to rebuild his life. The physical wounds had healed, but the emotional scars remained. Every time he drove past the spot where the shooting had occurred, a wave of anxiety washed over him. He couldn't forget that day, couldn't shake the memory of those bullets ripping through his body, the sight of his son's terrified face. But he was a survivor. He had faced death and lived to tell the tale, and he wasn't about to let Kevin Rojas take anything more from him. He continued his work as an officer, though his approach to the job had changed. He was more cautious now, more aware of the dangers lurking around every corner. But he was also more determined than ever to protect his community, to ensure that what had happened to him didn't happen to anyone else. In the end, both men's lives had been irrevocably changed by that one fateful encounter. Rojas would spend the rest of his days behind bars, living with the consequences of his actions. And Richards would carry the weight of that day with him, the scars a constant reminder of the price of survival. For Rojas, life in prison was a slow descent into despair. His days were spent in isolation, his thoughts consumed by regret and anger. And as the years passed, the weight of his life sentence pressed down on him, crushing any hope he had once held on to. But for Richards, there was hope. Despite the pain, despite the trauma, he had survived. And in that survival, there was strength. In the end, justice had been served, but the scars left behind would never fully heal.